Right, first of all, David spoke earlier this morning. David is Scottish, I am Welsh, right? We have in common that we are not English. That is very important. But it also means that you will have to deal with regional accents. And one thing that the Welsh do is we speak very, very quickly. So if I start to do that, feel free to make slow down signs, all right? I'll do my best. My job is to introduce some new ways of thinking, not just about IT development, but also about strategy. About every 10 to 20 years, we go through a major paradigm shift, a different way of thinking. And we're in the middle of one of those at the moment. If I look at the work we're doing with companies like Boeing, Intel, and others, we're now moving into an area where people accept that uncertainty is a part of life. And people who can embrace uncertainty can survive into the next few decades. The trouble is, for the last 20 to 30 years, we've taken an engineering approach to both management and software, not an ecological approach. And the problem with engineering approaches is they require too much definition for conditions of deep uncertainty. So I'm going to argue very strongly against a manufacturing metaphor for managing software development. The idea that users define things and then you deliver a product is only appropriate for stable, structured requirements. It isn't appropriate for dynamic realization of the increasing capability of technology that users don't even understand until they start to play with it. So I'm going to argue here for an ecological model. And also going to argue for the importance of people to understand theory, not just practice. And here I want to make a key difference between somebody who cooks using recipe books and somebody who is a chef. So the recipe book user will produce a competent meal, provided they have all the right ingredients and all the right equipment. A chef will produce a brilliant meal with whatever you happen to have lying around. And the difference between the two is a chef has learned over 5, 10, 15 years how to cook without having to think about it. It's called an apprentice model. The London taxi driver that David mentioned earlier drives around the streets of London for 2 to 3 years in their own time at their own cost, until they know the name of every street and they can actually describe a route from any 2 points, outwards and backwards, turn by turn, mentioning every major landmark and hotel. That can't be achieved in less than 2.5 years, because the brain and the body have to co-evolve, a concept I'll come to later, to the point where they can operate intuitively or instinctively. And the hippocampus of a London taxi driver's brain is significantly enlarged compared with other human beings. There's a physical change to the brain to allow that type of knowledge to work. And I produced software code for many years of my life. After 2 to 3 years within a language, your fingers can do things on a keyboard without you having to think about it. Yeah? And that's an apprentice model. But the other thing the chef has is theoretical knowledge. They know about taste. They study the history of food. They look at different recipes. So if they don't have one ingredient, they can replace it with another. They can choose to break the rules. And they can only do that because they understand theory as well as practice. And a major problem that we have in management theory, in software development, is that everybody is seeking recipes that they can follow, rather than developing principles and understanding to give them adaptability. And that slide there from Hugh, brilliant cartoonist, makes the point. All paths up are different, all paths down are the same. I can give you a recipe to fail, but anybody who tries to give you a recipe to succeed is a snake oil salesman, a charlatan, a con man. Yeah? Companies who succeed do it not by imitating what other people have done, but by changing the whole ecology, the market within which they operate. They change the game, they don't follow past practice. So my job at the start of today is to give you some of the theory coming sideways from cognitive neuroscience, from ecology, from complexity theory, and then talk about some of the practice. So I make no apology now for introducing new language. Because if you don't change people's language, you don't change the way they think. Yeah, to break in trained patterns of the way we've always done things is very difficult at all ages in terms of the way things work. So, fundamental principle, there are no recipes for success. So, the problem we have is that the market has developed to demand them. Anybody read a book by Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah. Well, the first one wasn't too bad. Anybody who's read Blink, if you know anything about cognitive neuroscience, you just hold your hands over your heads in despair. It's a classic example of a journalist picking examples to support a theory which is actually unsustainable. Yeah? The reality is a whole book's been produced to counter that sort of absurd populism. But what you see, and this is common to, you see this in Agile, for example. Anybody come across a thing called SAFE, Scaled Agile Framework? Okay, well, please try and avoid it at all costs. Yeah? It's not safe to fail, it's safe doomed to fail. Because it's an attempt to actually make things so simple that nobody finds them difficult or challenging. And that's actually quite dangerous, yeah, in terms of the way things work. But people love these very simple approaches with huge evidence. You know, this is kind of like the millennial cult. It's the new religion. Adopt my method, and the solution to life, the universe, and everything will be yours. Now, we need to move away from that. We need to be more sophisticated in terms of the way we operate. So, let's introduce some concepts. I'm not sure why I have a picture of a leopard there, but I took that 4 weeks ago, and I'm proud of it. Right? So it makes a sort of natural systems sort of feel to it. And it's a new camera. It was good. So 3 key concepts. 1, acceptation. Now, you'll all be familiar from evolutionary biology with the concept of adaptation. So a dinosaur's feathers adapt over time for sexual display or warmth. And you can see how that happens because it can happen progressively over many generations. Then one day, a dinosaur with a lot of feathers discovers it can glide between trees. And that's when we get what's called acceptation. We get the development of flight and birds. Now, it couldn't have happened in an ordinary way, because if dinosaurs threw themselves off trees before they had feathers, they would die, which means they couldn't breed, so the trait couldn't develop. Now, acceptation is where a trait which evolves for one function suddenly moves sideways and gets used for something else instead. And it turns out that most evolutionary history has been acceptive, not adaptive. This, for example, that pink bit is the human cerebellum. It evolved in the apes to manipulate muscles in your fingers so you could pick seeds from seed pods. Adaptation over time. It then accepted to manage the manipulation of grammar in human language. The sophistication of human language couldn't evolve naturally. It required something else to develop first, which could leap sideways. Now that has major implications if you think about it. In 1947, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in their pocket. From that, we got microwave ovens. Acceptation, not adaptation. And you can find many other examples in technology. But the key thing to understand about acceptation is it requires you to manage for accidents. An English phrase here, I'm not sure if it translates to Russian, is serendipity. Yeah? A beneficial accident or encounter. In order to allow for serendipity, which is key, systems have to be inefficient, not efficient. If you make systems too efficient, they focus on what you currently know, not what you may need to know in the future. So introducing degrees of inefficiency, degrees of slack into systems, are key for innovation and progress. If you over-focus on stripping away all surplus capacity, running systems at 90% utilization, requiring strict definition of requirements before you do anything, you're radically reducing the possibility of acceptation and therefore you're damaging your ability to strategically adjust and be agile at speed. So exaptation is a key concept, and I'll talk later about some of the work we're doing there. Second concept is coevolution. Certain species have co-evolved to the point where they're interdependent. So in coevolution, one thing encounters another thing, patterns form from those encounters, they become mutually dependent, and over time, the two actually become entwined. If anybody has teenage children, anybody? You know about coevolution. You can't, when they reach the age of 14, and you start to think that there was something you did 13 years and 3 months ago that maybe was a bad idea, you can't say, let's do a strategic reassessment of our child rearing strategy. Let's call in McKinsey's. Let's set new key performance indicators. Let's have mission statements for our goal as a family and an educational program to start again as a family unit. Does anybody really think that's possible? I should say I satirized this in the United States recently, and somebody discovered that there is a consultancy firm which is doing this for families. But that is a society disintegrating when that happens. The reality is, whenever you deal with children, you're dealing with the present, their perception of the present, and their perception of the past. That's what coevolution is about. When you deal with users, when you deal with markets, you're always dealing with perception of the present and perception of the past, and you're moving forwards. You can never start again from scratch. In architecture, people talk about greenfield and brownfield development. So in greenfield, you can start from scratch. There have been no previous buildings. In brownfield, you've got to build on an industrial past. Anything we do with systems of any nature, IT or otherwise, involves brownfield architecture, not greenfield architecture. And that actually damages an awful lot of current practice in terms of the way we work. And then we move on to cognition. This is actually quite scary. The only people who make rational, logical decisions based on a careful assessment of available evidence are people who are autistic. So if you're autistic, you are a rational creature in the conventional sense of the word. But you can't operate because you can't handle a sheer volume of information which is hitting you. The danger is the two departments in universities with the highest degree of partial autism are computer science and finance. So we need to be careful here, because something which is actually a very useful skill in those areas is dangerous elsewhere. There's a high degree of dyslexia in strategy and marketing, because dyslexics make associations between things very quickly, but not logically. And that strategically has huge advantage. But the trouble is the two communities find it difficult to talk with each other because they see the world differently. So recognizing that difference is key. The most you'll scan of what is in front of you is about 5%. And that's where you're really focused. So a radiologist looking at an X-ray, right, don't get scared about this, or maybe get scared, will only look at about 5% of the available information. They then match that partial data scan against approximately 30 to 40,000 patterns stored on their brain. And the patterns come from training, from experience, from stories told to them by other radiologists. And the most frequently used patterns are nearer the surface of the brain, so they get used first. So we evolved to make a first fit pattern match based on partial data scanning, not to do a best fit pattern match based on complete data scanning. Now that has big implications. And you can think about it in evolutionary terms. Think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. And as far as I know, the book of Jonah is the only example of this, and I don't recommend building a business practice on that basis. We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data scans. So when you present a new system to a body of users, what do you think happens? They scan 1 or 2% of what you say, and they match it against the stored patterns of previous experience. Now it gets even worse. We remember failure better than we remember success. We actually store failure more or less instantly, but it can take 24 seconds for our brain to store success. The reason is avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. Yeah, and that is a key issue on a whole body of new approaches to strategy. We define where we don't want to go, which leaves open possibilities that we might want to explore, rather than trying to define exactly where we want to be, which closes off possibilities that we haven't yet seen. So people are looking at your system proposal, and they're filtering it through patterns of past IT failure. And guess what? There's a lot of those. And that's how they see things. This is also how brand works. If I see a lovely little, translucent apple on the back of a MacBook with a bit chucked out of it, it activates deeply favorable patterns. On the other hand, if I see 4 colors in a rectangle, it activates deeply negative patterns, and that's how I see the world. Yeah? It means in marketing now, and in user requirements capture, and in user acceptance testing, we're now doing what's called double-hit communication. First, a brand of communication to activate the right patterns, and then we deliver message or communication. We don't just go cold. And you can't stop people making decisions like this. In fact, if you try and implement a best practice system, you're fighting 200 years of evolution, which says, 200,000 years of evolution, which says it's a bad idea. We now build worse practice systems, which people thoroughly enjoy, learn from, and use. Because as a species, we evolved to do that. We didn't evolve as engineers designing the perfect machine. We have survived as hominoids in an environment controlled by predators. Yeah, and actually that, if we can go back to that, gives us major advantage as we move forward. And of course, experts are the worst on this. Again, going back to radiologists, I don't know what it is about radiologists. I think they offended the cognitive neuroscientists at some point, so all the experiments are done on them. And as you can see here, we actually put a picture of a gorilla into an X-ray, which is significantly larger than a cancer nodule, and even though their eyes saw it, they didn't pay attention to it. We've done controlled experiments with the UN, work that we do with narrative. We've taken stories indexed by Roma kids from Roma communities in Eastern Europe, so self-interpreted within the Roma community. Yeah, as we all know, that's a major problem area in European terms. The same with young girls who've been subject to genital mutilation and rape in Africa. We've then taken those stories indexed by those people. We've given them to experts and asked the experts to index those stories the way they think the people themselves would have done it. And we get strong correlation among the people in the field and strong correlation between the experts, but zero correlation between the two. If you have high expertise, you tend to see things in terms of what you want to do, not what's actually happening. And again, you can't stop that. That's just part of the way we are. Now, there are ways to work around that. I'm going to come on to that. And for people coming on the 3-day course next week, we'll do a lot of work on this. But the first stage is to realize that that is the human condition. If you try and train people not to do it, they will lose all sorts of other capability that you really need. So working with how people are, not how an engineer would like them to be, is a key aspect of this work. Okay, so hold that, because that's a whole body of work about how we make decisions. Yeah? Now let's look at some statistics. Here I'm looking at risk management, but this could also be market research. Traditionally, we assess risk based on a normal distribution, a bell curve. And the idea is that you manage for things kind of like in the middle of the bell curve, in the center of the distribution. Anything in the tail, which is a thin tail here, is considered so unlikely it's not going to happen, or if it does happen, you can't be expected to plan for it. In market research or user requirement documentation, people eliminate outliers. Yeah, the idea is we're managing for the norm for the center, either in requirements definition or whatever. So that's kind of like cool. You can see the advantage. The trouble is, it doesn't often happen in nature. If I do a double log scale of size against frequency for virtually any natural phenomena, I get this thing, a straight line. It's not straight at the top. I'll come back to that, which is called a power law, which is a type of Pareto distribution. So this one is earthquakes. There are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes. A lot of small software errors, a small number of large software errors. A lot of small startups, a small number of large startups. I could go on. Virtually any phenomenon which has been studied will follow that curve. Now, if I overlay Pareto on Gaussian, I get this. It's called a fat tail. Simply by changing the distribution, I change the risk. And of course, Pareto distributions are more common than Gaussian distributions. Because in the fat tail, and I remember calling this the New Orleans levees problem. People assess the risk that the New Orleans levees would fail on the assumption that flooding is Gaussian, when actually flooding is Pareto. So the so-called 1 in every few centuries risk was actually a 1 in every few decades risk. Now this has major implications, because actually you can't possibly manage to prevent all failure in a fat tail. You might be able to prevent it in a thin tail, but not a fat tail. So we now switch from a strategy, and this applies to corporate strategy, it applies to software development, software architecture. We move to a strategy based on resilience, not robustness. So robustness is trying to prevent all failure up front. Resilience is actually recognizing that failure is inevitable. It's not trying to pretend that this time we'll get it right. Actually, you always get something wrong. The issue is, how fast do you discover it? How fast can you recover from it? And then coming back to exaptation, how fast can you exploit the new opportunities that that failure has provided? Because actually failure always opens up interesting new possibilities if you pay attention to it in the right way. And this is the new dynamics of strategy, a new way of thinking. But it also changes the way we monitor things. So coming back to the Pareto world, remember I said it wasn't straight at the top? That's because that's a domain where many things have happened in the past which will repeat exactly the same way in the future. It's a many-to-many relationship, a synchronous relationship, which means I can use the past to predict the future. I can take examples of what's worked. From that, I can derive general rules, and I can use those rules to determine how I work in future states. That's the best practice approach, the case-based approach. It's all those things. Nothing wrong with it there, provided I've got enough examples in the past and I've got symmetry of the numbers. So there, I can work on probabilities. However, as I move further to the right, the world changes. Now, the number of things which have happened in the past, which will repeat in the same or similar ways in the future, is going down, whereas the number of possible events in the future is starting to rise dramatically. So the relationship is now becoming asymmetric, not symmetric. Which means actually if I use the past to predict the future, I've got a problem. Now this is normally overcome at this space by scenario planning, contingency planning, zones of possibility, prototyping. We've developed a whole body of ways to work here, all of which have legitimacy, but all of which assume a hypothesis-led approach. If you do scenario planning, you look at hypotheses about the future state, and you entertain a broad range of hypotheses. The trouble is that once you've constructed a hypothesis, you tend not to see things that fall outside that. In fact, there's an argument under conditions of extreme uncertainty that people who plan for scenarios are more vulnerable rather than less vulnerable because they're trying to work within the limits of their contingency plans rather than adapting very quickly in the field. Again, nothing wrong with doing this, but recognize the limitations. So hypothesis-based approaches or case-based approaches, that's inductive logic, are actually okay here, but as I move further to the right, life gets really interesting. This is where the number of things which have happened in the past, which are relevant to any forecasting in the future, is actually very little. It's a fully asymmetric relationship. What James March in organizational science called the problems of samples of one or less. And actually, if you think about it, that's where entrepreneurial behavior, startups, everything, they don't repeat the past, they create something novel in the future. And this is where we move into the field where I and my colleagues work, where I'm having to deal with anything which is plausible, and of course, probable, possible, plausible, the set of things increases each time and increases exponentially. Which means we move into a new type of research called non-hypothesis or abductive-based research. For those of you who don't remember your logic, deduction, if A, then B. Induction, all the cases of A have B, so I can assume some linkage. Abduction, what's the most plausible connection between two apparently unconnected things? Now, actually, for innovation, we need abductive thinking, not inductive thinking. The good news is, as a species, we evolved to think abductively, not inductively, which is interestingly why we're very susceptible to conspiracy theories, because we make connections even though we can't see a logic on it, because overall that gives us survival capability. So how do we actually make abductive more effectively accurate, more predictable, is where I've been working for the last 15 years. And just to give you an illustration, I'll come back to this later, we're now getting rid of systems analysts from the whole user requirement process. Because systems analysts always go in with a hypothesis. If you don't know it, once somebody has conducted more than 2 to 3 interviews, their brain forms a subconscious hypothesis, and they only hear things that match that hypothesis thereafter. That's just life. So we want to remove that process because it will reduce what we see. We're now taking a statistically valid sample of the population, and they actually, every day, they find something which doesn't work. They think of something, wouldn't it be nice if something would do this for me? All those day-to-day fragmented observations get put into an app and self-interpreted into a high abstraction framework. I'm going to go through this next week, but just hold it to that level for the moment. These are actually deliberately ambiguated index structures. They don't have hypotheses in them. So I've got continuous quantitative data coming in from a large, broad population of users. As those narratives or those observations start to cluster to a level of statistical significance, then programmers start to develop prototypes against the narratives, working directly to the user stories, working on ideas or technologies that they think might help. Notice there's no user requirement yet. We're doing something which is actually a pre-process to actually start to increase the interaction between user stories and technical knowledge to explore possibilities before we move into major investment. We're doing the same with market research and elsewhere. And this is kind of like taking those co-evolutionary and acceptation problems on. So that's a different way of thinking, a different way of working. It also means in, for example, software testing, and we originally developed this stuff in counterterrorism, we're now looking to software testers to keep logs in which they record every fault. Because what I want to be able to look at is a pattern of statistical records over thousands of small faults to get early indications that a bigger problem may be coming downstream. And this is called anticipatory alerts. We're doing the same thing to actually give forecasts of premature discharge from hospitals, of children potentially being abused, and in military strategy, you can't forecast what the enemy will do, but you can trigger humans to a heightened state of alert when the plausibility of something different is much higher. Now again, we'll go through more of this next week, but I'm just trying to get the point across. We're trying to maintain dynamic flexibility. We're trying to prevent things being defined too early so that we can explore possibilities which we otherwise wouldn't have discovered. For those of you into Scrum, this is called a pre-Scrum process. And again, that's something I'll come back to. It's stuff we do before we get to Scrum, before we move into a sprint and all those sort of things. So that leads me on to the next thing, which is complexity theory. And this is the last bit of theory. General world for what I do is called making sense of the world so that we can act in it. Now with that comes a key concept of sufficiency. It's how do I know enough to act, because I can never know everything I want to know. So the concept of sufficiency for action is a key concept under uncertainty. Now in nature, there are 3 types of systems: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Now, different people use the language in different ways. It's a new field. We haven't yet got the language conformed. Yeah? And I use chaos in a different way from a lot of people, so I'm going to define my terms. An ordered system is one where the level of constraint is so high that all behavior and actions are predictable and controlled. Nothing wrong with this. It's interestingly unique to humans as a species. We're the only one which does it. So these days in hospitals, we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as were there at the start. As I get older, I think this sort of check is of increasing importance. You do not want to know how many surgical instruments were left in people's bodies before this check procedure was put into place. Nothing wrong with it, it's good news. The trouble is we then get seduced by order and we want it all the time. So I worked for IBM for 7 years. IBM is the world's largest example of a rigid bureaucracy. It makes government procurement look dynamic and adjustable. And one of the things you learn fast in IBM is don't challenge the process, work around it. So one day, IBM decided to ban any purchase of food for staff on software teams. Bad idea, save money, shouldn't be doing it. Now the secret with HR departments who do this sort of thing is not to argue with them logically, they can cope with that. The secret is to adopt a Socratic technique. You ask them innocent questions and see how they respond. It's also more fun. So he said, what do we do at 4 o'clock in the morning where I've kept the software team up all night to have a client system live at 9 a.m. And the only thing I can do as a manager is buy them pizza and Coke, I do mean the drink, not anything else, just to be clear on this, in order to keep them awake. And sat and looked at them. Said, oh, well, okay, if you ask permission in advance, you can do that. How do we ask permission in advance for a crisis? If we knew we were going to have a crisis, we wouldn't have one. Yeah, that's the nature of these things. Now, at this point, they're getting very unhappy, so they resorted to the classic large organizational bureaucratic response, which is to say yes in a way which means no. Yeah, they're very clever at doing this. And they said, okay, after the event, with the approval of the country general manager. Now, everybody in IBM knows this means your expense claim will disappear somewhere. And if you make a complaint, your name will become visible to people who you don't want to be known to in that context. So the practice emerged, and I gave this story at Scrum Agile in Berlin only 4 or 5 weeks ago, and somebody from IBM ran up to me afterwards and said, we're still doing that, so it's still around, of over-tipping a London taxi driver. Because if you over-tip a London taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. So people filled out the blank receipt for the amount of the food and submitted that receipt because it would go through the expenses while the food wouldn't. Start to sound familiar? Anybody who lives in a bureaucracy learns not to challenge the bureaucracy, but to find a way around the system. So the problem is, although the system appears very, very efficient at surface level, it's becoming increasingly inefficient underneath the surface, because people of goodwill are having to break the rules to get the job done, despite itself. So order is fine within limits. It's very dangerous when things are changing constantly. Then we get a chaotic system. In a chaotic system, everything is random. There are no connections. Now, chaos never exists for long in nature. Constraints emerge very quickly. And the secret in a crisis is to be the one who imposes the constraints. Because if you don't, somebody else will do it, and then it will be too late. In fact, one of the things we say to companies is always have an innovation team ready to go in parallel with your crisis management team. So if you have a crisis management process, trigger an innovation process in parallel. Because during a crisis, you've never had a better opportunity to change things. Once the crisis is over, the opportunity is lost. And also during a crisis, things will become visible, which nobody's seen before, and you want some people looking for those because they're new opportunities. That's just life. Okay? But there are two valuable areas we can do. If I can deliberately create a degree of chaos within some containable boundaries, I get radical innovation. Because if I remove constraints, things rub together in very different ways. And actually, if you look at it, it's during war that we innovate. Because we're always on the edge of chaos, therefore we're forced to scan more broadly, and technology advances more quickly. Yeah, and that's the reason for it. You've got a system with very few constraints. The other area we use it for is for mass sensing, something popularly known as wisdom of crowds. Now, there are two examples of this which everybody quotes, so you might as well have them. A group of farmers guessing the weight of a cow. If all of the farmers guess the weight of the cow, but none of them know what the other farmers have guessed, then the average of all of the guesses is actually generally the weight of the cow. American submarine, which grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1960s, they gave partial data about its location to different groups of experts around the world, didn't allow any of them to know who the other experts were. None of them estimated the position correctly, but the average of all of the estimates was 150 meters away from the submarine. Now, there are sound cognitive science and statistical reasons why this works. We're now creating sensor networks of employees or customers where we can ask a question in real time of a huge network of people and then take a graphical interpretation of their response to actually create an objective assessment under conditions of uncertainty. Because remember, you only scan 2 or 3% of what's in front of you. But if I have a sensor network of 2,000 or 3,000 people, we scan everything, working with how people evolved rather than how you would like them to be. So chaos has value. And then we get complex adaptive systems, which are the most common. This is where the constraints are partial, so they modify behavior. But as you interact with the constraints themselves change. Remember coevolution? The two are co-evolving with each other. So effectively, a complex adaptive system, you can never, ever know the future. Complex adaptive systems, you can basically understand their propensities and their current disposition, but you can't predict the future state. Interesting, with a chaotic system, I can build models, and actually with an ordered system, I can build models, but with a complex adaptive system, to quote Murray Gell-Mann, the famous physicist, the only valid model of a human system is the system itself, which is why we build human sensor networks of users, of customers to get around that. Now, this is actually fascinating because we're now dealing with systems which have no inherent causality, where the future cannot be predicted, but I can describe the present. And that changes the way we think. So imagine, if you want, around a circular surface, I've got electromagnets. In the middle of the surface, I've got cast iron hockey pucks. Yeah? Sorry, I need to make this so that the physicists won't complain to me about metaphors, all right? So I'm deliberately doing that. Now, if all of the magnets keep the same strength and the same polarity, the iron hockey pucks will form a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, they'll change in a predictable and repeatable way. In systems thinking, which has dominated the last 3 decades, that's called a driver. And all the recipes say, what are the drivers of consumer behavior, the drivers of employees' behavior? Because they're looking for a lever they can pull, which will produce a predictable response. Yeah? So that's drivers. Fine. The trouble is, if the system is a complex adaptive system, when this magnet changes, 3 others change polarity, 5 others change strength. So the same thing only ever happens again the same way twice by accident, and you can't forecast it. And we call the magnets modulators. So a complex adaptive system is modulated, it's not driven. Now, the point about this is, dependent on what type of system you're in, you will manage in a radically different way. Now, the best way I've ever learned to explain this is to think about managing a children's party. So can everybody imagine a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids? Yeah? Everybody got the image? No? Okay, well, there are 3. Let's assume the party is chaotic, because the argument is what type of system it is determines the way you manage it. But if the party is a chaotic system, it means the children's behavior is completely random, so they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft, and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? Yeah. I don't recommend this approach. I've got friends in California who've tried it, but never more than once. The recovery cost is very high. This is what agile communities talk about with self-organizing teams. It has roughly the same effect. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, you'd be more familiar with. Under this, you agree clearly articulated learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. They should be aligned for the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong, and they should be printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropped into ponds and placed around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can check against progress against ideal party outcome. The senior adult should then start the party with a motivational videotape. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If for any remote reason the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? Complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off, we draw a line in the sand, known as the boundary and complexity theory. We look the children squarely in the eyes, and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries. Because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and then breaking catastrophically. Then we introduce catalytic probes. A football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, in the hope that a pattern of play will form, which is called an attractor. And if it's a good one, we amplify it, we give it more resource. If it's a bad one, we dampen it, we take resource away. So what we do is manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And what emerges is a sustainable, resilient pattern of play and society, and we could not have predicted it at a detailed level in advance. And that's the new approach to business strategy, software development, systems architecture, and everything else. Define the boundaries. Define through narrative the places you don't want to go. Run experimental probes, see what works. We explore the evolutionary potential of the present, which is knowable, whereas if we try and design to an idealistic future state, we doom ourselves to perpetual disappointment. Every time you say, we're building a new system, and look at all of our wonderful benefits, everybody filters 3% of what you say and says, how many times have I been through this before? Oh my God, another disaster. On the other hand, if you move that progressive approach, it's very different. Now, I gave you the example of what we're doing with user requirement specs. We're no longer going to the users and asking them what they want because they don't know what technology can do. Added to which, they only know what they don't like about the current system. So you've got a limited scan. Yeah? Not only that, systems analysts always have pet solutions. So they only listen to things that match those solutions. That's just life. So instead of that, a continuous scanning mechanism of multiple users recording day-to-day frustrations. As patterns form, and it has to be quant from that, we develop small working prototypes against those needs which get tested on panels. They then move into sprints for operational production if they succeed. We need to start building object-oriented architectures in which applications emerge from the interaction of objects within constraints, rather than designing applications up front. Things like SAP implementations. Anybody implemented SAP? Anybody tried to pay a small supplier after you've done it? Yeah? SAP manages for the center of a normal distribution. Actually, the real opportunity and the real threat comes from clusters in the tails of distribution. And we need to architect to manage those clusters in the tail as much as the norm. Yeah, and that actually we can do with this approach. So you start to build architectures with adaptability. You start to treat people as objects too, and I mean objects in the software sense. They have inheritance, they have polymorphism, they have input-output. You allow patterns to emerge. And here, you don't use a conventional Kanban board. Because if you're dealing with a complex system, you actually don't have that type of environment. You can't afford to put things into structured boxes. Part of the conversation David and I have been having for about a year or so now is how do you create a visual representation of what I call messy coherence, where you can start to see patterns emerging and you need to make that visible quickly so you can consolidate them. And only once you've moved out of the complex domain into the ordered domain do you move into the manufacturing models and the structure. It also means that you progressively change the batch size as you go through the process. So moving on, the Cynefin framework, which I'm going to go on to here, and it really is a way of instantiating that. And I presume nobody here speaks Welsh. Okay. Cynefin is a Welsh word. It doesn't have an English equivalent, which kind of like says something about the English. The literal translation is habitat or place. But nobody in Wales would use it for anything that trivial. What it actually means is the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense of being rooted in many different pasts which profoundly influence what you are, but of which you can only ever be partially aware. So it's a good name for a complexity model because that's the nature of it. The reason the English don't have an equivalent, by the way, is they've never had a place of their own. They've only ever stolen other people's. And we haven't forgiven them for the 13th century yet, and we don't plan to any day yet. So what Cynefin does, and this is the model, it breaks order into obvious and complicated. Now remember, in an ordered system, there are repeating relationships between cause and effect. The same thing will happen the same way twice. The constraint level is high. I can predict it. The difference is, in obvious, everybody can see what the right thing is to do. So, for example, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. If you choose to drive on the right-hand side of the road in a civilized country, you can expect the consequences. And actually, last night, my taxi driver backed up into the one-way street outside, and I left him having an interesting conversation with the police. I'd like to know what happened as a result of that, but that's another story. So basically, we agree certain things. We could, I mean, in Britain, we could have driven on the left or the right. In Stockholm, they decided in the 1960s to change from driving on the left to the right, which was a brave decision. Yeah, they probably couldn't do it now. There's too much traffic. Even then, it was difficult. But the point is, everybody buys into the choice. Oh, by the way, the Italians don't bother. Yeah. If anybody's driven south of Naples, all right, this has been studied. Italian drivers operate in the same way as birds flock. Yeah. Fly to the center of the flock, match speed, avoid collision. It's actually quite a good organizing principle. Right? So either way, we agree a convention, we agree a way of doing things, which is why we can apply best practice. And our constraints here are rigid. On the other hand, if it's complicated, it's not self-evident to all reasonable people what we should do. So we have to do analysis, we have to persuade people, we have to bring in expertise. Our constraints now are governing constraints, but they're not fully rigid, which means we allow good practice, not best practice. We allow some variation in what people do if they have the right training and expertise. And this is actually where rigid approaches to methods are quite dangerous, because again, you're working for the center of a distribution where the interesting stuff is happening in the tails. So that's basically there. That's waterfall processes. That's manufacturing processes. All those sort of good things work in those spaces. In the complex domain, remember the children's party story? We have constraints, but they can be modified. So they're called enabling constraints. So for example, self-organizing teams in Agile have no constraints. So actually, they don't work consistently. We have an approach to self-organizing teams where people choose who they work with, but there are constraints about the categories of people that have to be on the team. You see the difference between a rigid constraint, HR would allocate people. A chaotic system, anybody can work with anybody. A complex system, we create enabling constraints, but within that you have freedom of action. Yeah, and that allows for emergence, acceptation, all these good things. And our model here is to probe sense respond. We run experiments early in parallel. Now, interestingly, for those of you into Scrum, Scrum is a technique for taking things from the boundary of complex into complicated. But it actually does multiple iterations of one thing to get it right. So that's a complex to complicated transition, and brilliant in the way it does it. No question. But actually, what it doesn't do is handle a truly complex one. That's where we need new techniques or new approaches, and that's the parallel safe to fail. Then, of course, down here in chaos, we have to act very quickly. There are no constraints whatsoever. Now, it's important to remember, people who draw Cynefin as a cross get it wrong. It's actually drawn as a series of sweeps. The central domain is known as disorder, which is a space of not knowing which of the domains you're in, which means you'll fall into the trap of doing what you're most comfortable with. Again, there's a whole process I'm going to go through on Monday of how we define this model, and we define it operationally in the context of the narratives that define the organization you're working for. That's key. So that's kind of like the model. The other thing to point out on it, before I finish off on this, is that fundamentally the boundary between obvious and chaos is shown as a catastrophic fold. That's because you fall over the edge into chaos if you assume things can be ordered when in practice they can't. That's called complacency. Now, again, what people tend to miss is the realization that this is the most important dynamic. You need things to go from complex to complicated. So as things become complex, things emerge, patterns emerge, you do parallel safety experiments, interesting things happen. As they start to work, you effectively put the brakes on, you increase the constraint, and you see if you can move them into complicated. If the brakes don't work, you pull back and start again, and you do it early. Now, a personal story to illustrate that. One of my hobbies is cycling, road cycling, and I do audax, which, if you don't know it, is you don't race against other people. You move in a huge body of people, but everybody has to average at least 15 kilometers per hour. And it's 100, 200, 300 kilometers. So it's fun, it's social. You can move between different groups, but there's a challenge. Now, if you're going to be in the saddle for 10 hours, you have a bike made for you. So one year, with one bonus, I got Dave Yates in Newcastle to make me a new bicycle. This is a fun process. You drive to Newcastle, you're measured, you drive back, you're fitted, you drive back, you collect it. It's like a suit. And once you've ridden the bike, which has been made for you, you wouldn't buy one from a shop anymore. So either way, so I go and pick up the bicycle, drive back home. It's a 500-mile drive, but this is the best guy for these things. I get to the Yorkshire Dales, which is a beautiful area of the UK. It's a blue, sunny day with clouds and no wind, perfect cycling day. And there's a cycle shop in the town that I'm driving through where I could buy some new cycle shoes and some new cycle gear, so I've fallen into temptation, and I take the bike out for its first ride. I get to the top of the Yorkshire Dales in a pub called the Tan Hill Inn, which is the highest pub in England, in record time compared with previous events. The bike is wonderful. I'm happy. I celebrate with 3 pints of Theakston's Old Peculiar. Now, you may not know Theakston's Old Peculiar. It is one of those dark, heavy, sweet British beers. And really, 1 pint would be enough. 3 pints is possibly dangerous. And I realized, coming down a very steep hill into Arthgarthindale, that my brakes were not fully functional. I've been cycling up all the time before. I hadn't tested them. And I had to make a choice, because by now I am up to 60 kilometers per hour, going high speed with a hairpin bend and a stone bridge. And I had to choose between myself and the bike. Well, I'm male. I've got a new toy. You know what I did. Yeah, so I fell sideways and cleated my feet, threw the bicycle sideways. I broke my arm. The cycle was okay. And for some reason, my wife, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, refused to drive out and rescue me. I was made to walk back, but that's the story for another day. Now, you'll remember the story, but remember the message of it. Test constraints early. As you impose constraints, if they bite, carry on. If they don't, pull back and carry on with the experimentation. The mistake too many people make, and it's called premature convergence, is rushing too quickly into a solution. Yeah? So that's the main dynamic. Every now and then, you'll need to do a strategic reset, a shallow dive into chaos. You've allowed patterns of previous behavior to get entrained, so you haven't got true innovation. And then only a very small amount of stuff drops down into this space. Now, it may be 90% of your business and 95% of your value, but it only goes there when it doesn't need to change. Because you can't afford for that level of constraint except for very, very stable aspects. So on the left-hand side of this model, which is called unorder, we're managing to create the conditions for the emergence of possibilities we could not have imagined in advance. And then we're shifting them to the right to exploit them very quickly. So we're taking that whole concept of agility, which underpins Agile, but we're saying before we move into Scrum, we have to do some other stuff first. Mass narrative inquiry, human sensor networks, safe-to-fail experimentation, clusters in the tail. All of these are techniques designed to reduce uncertainty by interaction with reality rather than by design. It's a difference between forecasting and sidecasting. In forecasting, you try and predict the future. In sidecasting, you cast around to see what's possible, and you experiment and you allow for emergence. That's a service relationship. Realizing that in service, product and need and capability co-evolve is key. You can't say, let the users define what they want, and neither can you say, let's give us, the users, what they need. You need capability and unarticulated need to co-evolve. Final example on this, and I'm going to stop. Work we did with one of the big lighting companies in Europe. We pulled in, I think, 3,000 self-interpreted narratives over a week from consumers about their gardens. The lighting company decided there might be a market for lights as part of a garden, not just to light the garden. We then got everybody in the technical silos to interpret their technologies at the right level of granularity into, again, one of these human metadata constructs, without even looking at the user needs. We then mashed the databases together, and we end up with 5 clusters in which consumer stories associated with technologies. Marketing looked at those clusters, and 3 of them are now multi-million-dollar businesses that nobody could have thought of before, because we took a technology which had been developed for one function and found a completely novel use for it. Start to get the principle? You change the granularity, you change the interaction early on. You look for anticipation, you look for difference. So what I've tried to do is to give you some of the theory, some illustrations of practice, but the key message on this is stop thinking in manufacturing metaphors until you've got a sufficiently stable, constrained environment you can think like that. Before that, think in terms of co-evolution, acceptation, human interaction to find out what's possible. And overall, you radically reduce cost, you hugely increase the chances of innovation, but critically, you start to actually interact with corporate strategy and corporate needs in such a way that they see technology as a strategic enabler, not a cost-based service. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dave. Вопросы сейчас есть? Опять нет вопросов? Есть вопросы. Отлично. У нас есть время для пары вопросов. Ну, можно по-английски, можно по-русски, я это переведу.
Хорошо, давайте я по-русски задам. Это все здорово, что вы рассказали.
I haven't got a translator. He'll translate for me. Okay, go on.
Но мне как-то не очень понятно, каково место реальных инноваций или изобретений во всех этих картинках.
Okay. I think that there are different types of innovation in different domains, all right? So, for example, in the complicated domain, you would expect what we call incremental innovation. So experts will innovate by improving what they've got, by making it better. Yeah? In the complex domain, you'll get something radical. A way I illustrate this, if you've ever seen the film Apollo 13, yeah? It's the American shuttle which went round the moon, and then halfway back they realized it wasn't going to work. Yeah? So what they did is they took all of the engineers and put them into a room and said that's what they got on the spaceship. Yeah? So what you got is effectively the 3 preconditions for radical innovation, which are starvation of resource, pressure of time, perspective shift, people we know are going to die. So they produced a radically new solution. And that's what I call Eureka Innovation. Yeah? Sudden, unexpected discovery. And that happens in the complex domain. It will never happen in the complicated domain. So if you give a really difficult, intractable problem to experts to solve, they will just solve it in the way they've solved all other problems. If you give it to people who are coming from a completely different or naive perspective, you see it differently. Yeah? And that's key. Chaotic is kind of like you really only want to go there under very controlled circumstances, and to be honest, it's a confession of failure when you go there. Yeah? You should be able to innovate within the complex domain, coming near to the boundary of chaos. If you deliberately remove all constraints, it might work for you. But actually, 98% of the chance you'll fail. The trouble is the case studies only tell you about the ones who succeeded. It's like lean startup. It's a nonsense. Yeah, the whole of the entrepreneurial marketplace works because there are thousands of people experimenting. They all do the same bloody things. Yeah? You can't use that as a predictive model. Yeah?
Здесь был еще вопрос, да?
Okay, imagine the situation when there is organization in an obvious domain, like a large enterprise or bank where boundaries were rigid, and people come from outside, from a complex domain. They are willing to build new products, new way of doing business, or bring some innovation. And they have a vision and waiting for an execution. So are there any successful ways of moving from complex domain through complicated into obvious, or are there any ways to go directly.
Yeah, we're going to do a lot of this next week, all right? But there are two or three ways. One is the concept of safe-to-fail experiments works. Because if you look at it in terms of conflict, when you have even in a large structured organization which thinks it knows what's going on, there are intractable problems. Issues where the conventional approaches don't work. Then the problem is that people with different hypotheses, the evidence supports competing hypotheses. So instead of trying to resolve that, anybody with a coherent hypothesis dive into chaos. You've allowed patterns of previous behavior to get entrained, so you haven't got true innovation. And then only a very small amount